Asher Voss had $340 left in the world, and every dollar of it already had a name on it, Wren's Medicine, due by Friday. That night, he found a dying stranger in an alley and gave every cent of it away without thinking twice. By morning, he learned the man he'd saved was the billionaire connected to his own father's death. This is what it cost him to do the right thing, and then to find out exactly who he'd done it for. Cordell, Indiana, used to be a town with a reason to exist. For almost 60 years, Cordell Steel Works ran 3 shifts a day and put food on the table for nearly every family within 20 miles. Then, 8 years ago, the gates closed for good, and the town has been quietly bleeding out ever since. Boarded storefronts on Main Street, a faded mural of the old blast furnace peeling off the back wall of the diner, a high school football team still called the Forgemen playing in front of bleachers that used to be full. Asher Voss was 26 when the plant shut down. He's 34 now, and on the night this story really starts, he wasn't thinking about the plant, or the town, or any of it. He was thinking about $340 and about a 7-year-old girl with a wheeze in her chest that got worse every time the weather turned. That morning, before his shift, Wren had stood in the kitchen in her socks, trying to act normal while she caught her breath between sentences, the way she always did when she didn't want her father to worry. Her old inhaler sat on the counter, nearly weightless when he shook it, the kind of empty that makes a sound like a warning. She'd shaken it herself first, listened to it rattle, and laughed like it was a joke between the two of them instead of a countdown. "I'm okay, Daddy," she'd said, when she saw him watching her too closely. "I can breathe slow till Friday. The new one's not that expensive anyway." It was $94 expensive, and Asher hadn't corrected her, because there was no version of that conversation a 7-year-old needed to be having. He'd just crouched down to her height, told her she didn't have to manage anything, that managing was his job and hers was just to be 7, and she'd rolled her eyes at him the way she'd started doing lately, like she already understood more about their life than he wanted her to. He kissed the top of her head, told her Grandma Della was coming by, and gone to work a double shift at the Anchor Diner so that $94, plus rent, plus everything else, would somehow be there by Friday. He never made it home with that money. Not because anything happened to him. Because of what he found in the alley behind Higby's pharmacy at 10:30 that night, 3 blocks from his apartment, in rain that had been falling sideways since 4 o'clock. At first he thought it was trash bags. Then the shape moved. An arm, reaching for nothing. The man was maybe 60, grey at the temples, slumped against the pharmacy's back wall in a wool coat that had clearly cost more than Asher's monthly rent, even ruined now and soaked through. No wallet. No phone. No umbrella. Lips going faintly blue. Breathing in short, rattling pulls that didn't sound like they had many pulls left in them. "Sir? Sir, can you hear me?" Nothing but that breathing, thin as paper. Asher looked toward the street. A couple of figures stood under the bar awning across the way, watching, not moving, the particular stillness of people who have decided something is bad and decided it isn't their problem. Cordell wasn't a cruel town. It was a tired one, and tired towns learn to look away first. Asher didn't look away. He pounded on the pharmacy's back door until a stock clerk he half recognized from high school, a big, slow-moving man named Gus Pemberton, came out wiping his hands on his apron, took one look, and didn't ask a single question. They got the stranger into Gus's truck and drove the 11 minutes to Cordell Memorial like the truck had a personal grudge against every red light in town. The receptionist behind the plexiglass at the ER didn't even look up at first. "Insurance? Identification? He doesn't have anything on him. I found him in an alley. Without ID or insurance on file, we require a deposit before treatment can proceed beyond triage." She glanced at her screen. "It's $340. Asher's hand went into his jacket pocket without him quite deciding to send it there, and his fingers closed around the folded bills, and against the pharmacy receipt for Wren's inhaler that he'd tucked in the same pocket that morning, the one with her name printed at the top in pharmacy block letters. Wren Voss. He stood there for one long second with both pieces of paper pressed together in his fist, the money and his daughter's name, and something in his chest pulled tight enough to hurt. For half that second, he almost turned around and walked back out into the rain. He thought about the inhaler rattling almost empty on the kitchen counter. He thought about Wren laughing about it like it was nothing. He thought about how easy it would be to tell the receptionist he'd misjudged, that he didn't have it after all, and just go home. Then, behind the double doors, he heard it, the stranger's breathing, audible even from the waiting room now, thinner than it had been in the truck. Asher set the bills on the counter. Take it. Just help him. He sat for 40 minutes before Dr. Calloway came out, tired and kind-faced, and told him the man had suffered a cardiac event triggered by exposure and dehydration, but that he was stable, and that whatever Asher had done in that alley had probably bought him the hour he needed to make it. Do you know him? No, Asher said. Never seen him in my life. He walked home in the rain with nothing in his pockets but his keys, his phone, and an empty pharmacy receipt with his daughter's name on it. Della Voss was still up when he let himself in, Wren long asleep on the couch. Asher's mother had buried her husband to that steel plant slowly, for winters of watching him cough himself smaller after the company stopped covering his inhalers and his specialists, and she had every reason in the world to have gone hard about strangers and money. Instead she just listened, all of it, in order, and then got up without a word and put a plate of food in front of him. You gave him the medicine money. I didn't think, Mom. He was dying. I know it. She didn't sit back down right away. By the door, where it had sat for 4 years untouched, was a pair of steel-toed work boots, laces still tied the way Roman had left them the last morning he wore them. Della's eyes went there for half a second, the way they always did when something reminded her of him, and then came back to her son. I keep meaning to give those boots away, she said, like it was a different conversation entirely. Somebody could use them. I never do it, though. You don't have to. I know I don't. She set the plate down in front of him and finally Saturday. Your father would have done the same thing for a stranger bleeding in the street, and you know it. Money comes and goes, son. That man's life don't come back twice. We'll figure Wren's medicine out. We always do. What if I can't this time, Mom? Then I'll sell something. I got things to sell. You got a daughter to keep breathing. There's no math where the second one don't win. She reached over and squeezed his hand once, hard, the way she used to when he was a boy and scared of something he wouldn't name. Eat. Asher didn't sleep much. Not from the cold. He went back to the hospital the next evening before his shift and found the man awake, propped against 2 pillows, some color back in his face. Asher had brought a slice of the diner's pie wrapped in a napkin, more out of habit than thought. It was what you brought people in that town, sick or not. You're the one who found me, the man said. That's me. Brought you pie. Cherry. It's not great, but it's free, which around here counts for something. He almost smiled at that. I owe you my life. Not as an expression. Plainly. Anybody would have done it. No, the man said, with a tired smile that didn't reach his eyes. I've had a great deal of time to think about how many people walked past me before you stopped. Asher pulled the visitor's chair closer. What happened to you? No wallet, no phone. You weren't dressed like a man who usually ends up behind a pharmacy. Something flickered behind the man's eyes, not quite a lie, but a door easing shut. Robbed, earlier that night. I'd had a difficult few days and made the mistake of walking somewhere I shouldn't have, alone. They took everything. I must have collapsed afterward. I don't remember much. Anybody I should call for you? I'll handle that myself, once I'm steadier. He studied Asher for a moment. What's your name? Asher. Asher Voss. Dorian, the man said, and offered nothing else, and Asher, exhausted and not particularly curious about a stranger's business, let it go. I didn't save a billionaire, Asher would say later, more than once, to more than one person. I saved a man. I found out the billionaire part after. He found out the next morning, when he came back to check on him and found the bed empty. A nurse named Odette told him, not unkindly, that the patient's people had collected him at midnight, private medical transport, 2 SUVs, a whole production, and seemed almost delighted to be the one breaking the news. "Honey, you really don't know who that was? That's Dorian Kasewicz. Used to run Kasewicz Steel Holdings before he sold the whole operation. Man's worth more than this entire town put together." Asher went very still, because that name had just clicked into place with the slow, sickening certainty of a lock turning. Kasewicz Steel Holdings. He'd known that name for 8 years, not from magazines, but the way you know the name of the thing that took your father from you. Before Meridian Alloy Group bought Cordell Steel Works and gutted it, the plant had belonged to Dorian Kasewicz, who'd built his fortune on furnaces just like the one that had run for 60 years on the edge of town, and who had sold the whole operation 8 years ago and walked away with a fortune the same year the town learned to live without one. He stood in the parking lot a long time, not moving, last night's rain still sitting in puddles around his boots, thinking about a pair of steel-toed work boots that had stood untouched by his mother's door for 4 years. Roman Voss had worked the furnace floor for 22 years. He used to come home smelling like heat and metal, his old Cordell steel lunch pail dented from 2 decades of use sitting by the door next to those same work boots, and he used to say a man who worked fire long enough started carrying a little of it inside him. He'd been a foreman by the time the sale went through, the kind of man other men listened to without him raising his voice, and like most of them, he believed the company line that nothing would change. It changed slow, and then it changed fast. The health plan got more modernized. The layoffs came in rounds, each one wrapped in a press release about efficiency. Roman survived the first 3. He didn't survive the 4th, and by then he'd already been coughing through 2 winters that the plant doctor had always written off as dust, back when there'd still been a plant doctor at all. Without the health plan, the cough became something the family had to pay out of pocket just to get a name for. Della still had the pension letter somewhere in a kitchen drawer, for pages of language dense enough that nobody in the house could say exactly when the benefits had stopped, only that one day the inhaler cost full price and the day before it hadn't. She still had the medical bills in a showbox on the closet shelf, the diagnosis that came 2 years too late to matter, an old inhaler of Roman's own that nobody had thrown away. There was a work shirt in that same closet, washed and folded and never worn out again, that Della still touched sometimes without meaning to, the way you touch a doorframe you've walked through 10,000 times. Asher remembered the lunch pail most of all, how it sat untouched on the same shelf by the door for the first year after, until one day it just wasn't there anymore, and neither of them ever asked the other what had happened to it, because some questions answer themselves. Roman Voss died 4 years ago in the back bedroom of that house, Asher holding one hand and Della holding the other, and the last thing he said, more to the ceiling than to either of them, was that he hoped whoever bought that plant slept fine at night, because somebody sure as hell wasn't going to. Asher had never had a name for that whoever. Now he did. For 3 days, nothing happened. No call. No visit. Asher told himself that was exactly what he'd expected. Rich men said thank you and went back to being rich. Poor men went back to making nothing stretch until Friday. Wren's inhaler ran low on Thursday. Walt Pruitt left a notice about rent on Friday. On the 4th day, 2 black SUVs pulled up outside the apartment. A tall man in a grey suit stepped out, scanned the building number against his phone, and approached with the practiced ease of someone whose entire job was making rich men's apologies land softly. "Mr. Voss? My name is Foster Lindquist. I work for Mr. Kasewicz." He extended a thick cream envelope. He wanted to express his gratitude. This is a token of that, a check, and his thanks. Asher didn't take it. "Send Wren inside, baby." She went, glancing back twice. "How much is in there?" "I'm not authorized to disclose." "I don't want it." Something in his voice made Foster go quiet. "I know exactly who Mr. Kasewicz is. I know he ran Kasewicz Steel Holdings. I know he sold the Cordell plant to Meridian 8 years ago and made himself richer doing it. I know what happened to this town after. My father worked that furnace floor 22 years and died 4 years ago because the insurance disappeared the same year your boss cashed his check. So no. I don't want his money. You can tell him I said that. Mr. Voss, I don't doubt any of that is true. But this isn't an attempt to settle anything. It's a thank you. Two separate things. They're not separate things where I'm standing. Asher held the envelope back out, and when Foster didn't immediately take it, set it down on the porch railing instead. He didn't earn that gratitude check sitting in a meeting room. He earned it bleeding in an alley, same as anybody else would've. Money doesn't undo what happened to this town, and I'm not going to pretend it does just because the number's got a lot of zeros on it. Foster Lindqvist nodded once, slow, like a man recalibrating an entire approach in real time, and got back in the car. 3 days later, an ordinary sedan pulled up, no SUVs, no entourage, and Dorian Kasewicz got out alone, older and more tired than the magazines ever let him look. "I understand you know who I am now," he said. "And that you turned down my check, and told my assistant exactly why." "That's right. I want to make this right." "You don't even know what this is," Asher said. "Sit down. You're going to hear all of it." So Dorian sat on the cracked concrete steps of an apartment building in the town his decisions had helped hollow out, and he listened, really listened, while Asher told him about a furnace flaw, a health plan that vanished in language nobody could pin down, a cough that became a diagnosis for years too late, a man who died wondering if anyone responsible would lose a single night's sleep over it. "I didn't kill your father, Mr. Voss," Dorian said quietly, when Asher finally stopped. "No," Asher said. "You just sold the gun and walked away before it fired." Dorian flinched, but didn't argue. "I had no operational control 18 months after the sale, when Meridian cut the health plan. You sold to them knowing what they were." "I told myself I didn't know. I'm old enough now to admit that's a much easier story to believe when you're being paid to believe it." He looked up, and for the first time his eyes weren't performing anything. "I didn't pull a single lever that hurt your father directly. I handed the levers to people I knew would pull them, and I walked away richer than I'll spend in the rest of my life, while your town got nothing. I have not come back here once in 8 years. Not until you saved my life and then handed my own money back to my assistant." "You didn't close that plant with your hands," Asher said. "You closed it with your signature. There's a difference on paper. There's no difference in my house." Dorian didn't answer that one right away. Somewhere down the block a dog was barking at nothing, and the silence between them stretched long enough to mean something. "My daughter needed that medicine," Asher said finally. "But you needed one more breath. I gave it to you without knowing who you were. I'm not sure I'd have given it to you if I had. I believe that. My father died wondering if anyone responsible ever lost a night's sleep over what happened to this town. So I'm asking you straight, Dorian. Did you?" It took Dorian a long time to answer. "Some nights," he said finally. "Most nights, no." Which is its own kind of answer, I think. "It is." Dorian stood, joint stiff from the cold step. "I'd like to see it." "Cordell." "The plant." "Not from a car window." "I'd like you to show me, if you're willing." "Tomorrow," Asher said. 10 a.m. "And you don't bring the SUVs." He came back the next morning in the plain sedan, alone, and Asher drove him through Cordell the way you'd walk a man through a museum of something that used to be alive, past the high school with its faded Forgemen banners, past 3 boarded storefronts in a row, past the chain-link fence around Cordell Steel Works itself, the sign-reading property of Meridian Alloy Group gone grey at the edges. Dorian gripped the cold metal links and stood there a long time, looking at the rusted shape of the furnace building like a man looking at a photograph of someone he used to be. "I built that 40 years ago. I knew every man on that floor by name. My father's name was Roman. They went to see Pearl Hutchins, who'd lost her husband 11 months after his pension got restructured into a third of what he'd been promised. She didn't invite them in past the porch. I used to send your company a Christmas card every year," Pearl said, arms crossed against the cold. "Wrote thank you for the work inside it, every single year, like a fool. My husband worked 30 years for that paycheck and died 11 months after it shrank to nothing, and I still don't rightly know who to send the bill to. Maybe it's you. Maybe it's the next one. Doesn't much matter now." "I'm sorry," Dorian said. I know that doesn't fix anything. No, Pearl agreed. It doesn't. But it's more than I got from the ones who actually signed the papers, so I suppose I'll take it. Then they went to Gideon Hartley, the old floor foreman who'd worked under Roman, and looked at Dorian with something colder and more patient than hatred. We used to think you were one of the good ones, Gideon said on his own porch. You knew our names. You came to the Christmas parties. Turns out all that meant was you knew exactly what you were selling us into, and you smiled at us right up until the day you cashed the check. Dorian didn't argue. You're right, he said, and that was somehow worse and better than any defense. By the time they stopped for lunch at the Anchor, word had already done what word does in a town of 12,000 people. Asher felt it the second they walked in, the room going quiet by degrees, forks pausing halfway, a waitress freezing mid-pour. Gideon had clearly made a phone call or two. Someone at the counter said the name Kasewicz under their breath like a curse word being tested out loud for the first time in years. An old man by the window who'd worked the rolling mill for 30 years just stared at his coffee and didn't look up once. Della was there. She hadn't planned to be, she'd come in to drop off a casserole dish for the owner, but she stopped cold in the doorway when she saw who was sitting across from her son, and the whole diner seemed to hold its breath waiting to see what Roman Voss's widow would do. She walked over slowly. Dorian stood, out of some old reflex of manners that hadn't yet caught up to the moment. Della didn't sit down. She didn't raise her voice, either. She just looked at him the way you look at weather that has already passed through and already done its damage. My husband died waiting for a doctor your paperwork took away, she said. I'm not going to make a scene in this diner. I just needed you to hear that from me, in person, one time, so you can carry it the rest of however long you've got left. She paused, and when she spoke again, it was quieter, almost to herself as much as to him. You can't buy forgiveness from the people you priced out of survival, Mr. Kasewicz. You can only show up and keep showing up, and let them decide, in their own time, whether that's worth anything at all. The whole room had heard it anyway. Dorian didn't apologize, not with words, not in front of a room full of people who would have heard it as theater. He just nodded, the same way he'd nodded on Gideon's porch, and let it land. Asher could have stepped between them. Could have hurried Dorian out the back, spared him the rest of the silence that followed them through the diner on the way to the door. He didn't. Some debts, he was starting to understand, weren't his to protect anyone from. I want to set something up, Dorian said, once they were back outside. A fund. Healthcare costs for former plant families, retroactive and ongoing. A trade center on the old plant site, if zoning allows it, something that puts people back to work instead of writing a sympathy check. I don't know if it fixes anything. It doesn't bring your father back. I'm not interested in feeling better about myself. I'm interested in not being the kind of man who only ever apologizes from 40 floors up. I'm not your friend, Dorian, Asher said. I saved your life because you were a person dying in an alley, and I'd do that again tomorrow for anybody. That doesn't mean I forgive what happened to this town. I'm not asking you to. Good. Because I can't give you that. But I'll help you build it right, if you mean it. Cordell doesn't need another rich man's guilt project with a ribbon cutting and an 18-month memory. You don't need your truth to be loud. You need it to be public. That evening, Asher came home to find Ren sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, holding a brand new inhaler up to the lamplight like it was something rare. Daddy, look. Grandma says the pharmacy lady called and said it was already paid for. All of it. The new one and the old bill too. She shook it experimentally, listened to it rattle full. Instead of empty, and grinned at him like the universe had simply corrected an old mistake. Did you get paid extra at the diner? Della was standing in the kitchen doorway, watching her son's face carefully, the way she'd watched him watch the boots by the door. Neither of them had to say the name out loud for both of them to know exactly whose money that was. No, baby, Asher said. I didn't get paid extra. Then who? Doesn't matter. Go on and use it before bed, the way you're supposed to. He didn't sleep well that night either, terming the same question over and over. He had refused Dorian Kasewicz's check on his own front steps, in front of a witness, on principle. And somewhere behind that refusal, without his permission, his daughter was breathing easier on a medicine he hadn't paid for, from a man whose signature, it would turn out, was already sitting in a folder he hadn't seen yet. He didn't know yet whether that made him a hypocrite or just a father. He suspected it might be both, and that he was going to have to live with that for longer than one night. It should have ended there. It didn't. Sterling Kasewicz landed in Indianapolis 2 days later and drove the rest of the way to Cordell himself, which Foster Lindqvist later said he'd never once seen him do for anything that wasn't worth at least 8 figures. 38 years old, raised on the other side of his father's fortune, never once set foot on a furnace floor, Sterling ran the family office now, and as far as he was concerned, Cordell, Indiana, was a closed chapter his father had no business reopening over the flattery of a line cook with a sob story and good timing. He found Asher alone outside the Anchor at the end of a shift. "Mr. Voss. I'll be direct, since I understand you respond well to that." Sterling's smile didn't move past his mouth. "My father had a cardiac event. He is not thinking with full clarity, and he is preparing to redirect a significant portion of family assets based on guilt manufactured by a man who happened to find him in an alley at the right moment. I'm prepared to make that worth your while privately, quietly, no further involvement required from you, so my father can be allowed to recover and move on without strangers attached to his name in the press. You think I did this for money? I think everyone does something for money eventually. I've simply learned to ask earlier than most people are comfortable with." "Your father's the one who taught me different," Asher said, "by accident, while you were busy not noticing." "Careful, Mr. Voss. It would be very easy for a reporter to write a story about a struggling line cook who attached himself to a sick billionaire and talked his way into a fortune. Easier still if that line cook has a habit of refusing checks in front of witnesses and then negotiating fund structures behind closed doors a week later. People believe the story that's simplest to tell. I'd hate for yours to become that one." "Go ahead and write it," Asher said. "I've got nothing left for anybody to take that they haven't already taken." He walked past him toward home. What Sterling didn't know, what he wouldn't find out until it was already too late to stop, was that Foster Lindqvist had been quietly uneasy for 8 years about a set of internal memos he'd filed away himself, back before the Meridian sale ever closed, the kind of memos junior staff aren't supposed to remember existing once the deal is done. That same evening, Foster knocked on Asher's door alone, no SUV, no envelope, just a plain manila folder held against his chest like it weighed more than paper should. "I don't work for him anymore as of tonight," Foster said. "I'm telling you that so you understand what this is costing me to hand over. I think you should see this before you decide how much of Mr. Kasewicz's guilt you're willing to believe." Asher opened the folder on his own kitchen table, under the bare bulb over the sink, with Ren asleep down the hall and Della's number already half-dialed on his phone before he'd finished reading the first page. His hands were steadier than he expected them to be. Some part of him, he realized, had been waiting for this since the moment Nurse Odette said the name Kasewicz out loud, waiting to find out whether the man on the cracked concrete steps had been telling him the truth, or just the version of the truth that was easiest to survive telling. It was a risk assessment, dated 14 months before the Meridian sale ever closed, a column of names under a heading that read Pension and Health Liability Exposure, Impact Timeline. Near the bottom of the second page, highlighted in a yellow that had gone brittle and pale with age, was a name Asher had known his whole life. Roman Voss, foreman, furnace floor, guesstimated health claim risk, high. And at the bottom of the last page, beneath a paragraph recommending the sale proceed on schedule regardless of projected impact to legacy workforce health obligations, was a signature Asher had only ever seen scrawled across a check he'd refused to take. Dorian Kasewicz. Not 18 months after the sale, when Meridian made its own decisions with its own hands. 14 months before it. While Roman Voss was still healthy enough to clock in every morning at 6 and come home smelling like heat and metal, somebody 40 floors above him had already written his name on a list of acceptable losses and signed underneath it without ever once saying his name out loud. Asher sat at his kitchen table for a long time with his father's name in his hands, highlighted yellow, 14 months before anyone in Cordell knew anything was coming. This is not the end. Part 2 is coming soon.